Hello. Welcome back, everybody, to Quantum Faith. This is part 2 today, which is called Probably. I got asked before the class if in the last week I had learned everything, and now I know it all. And yes is the no, please. I still don't know anything about science, which brings me to we're going to review just a short bit about my disclaimers for the class as we get into it. If you were here last week, you remember these, but it's a good refresher. Number 1 is I am not a science teacher, much less a quantum physicist. We do have some scientists here in the room. I see Tom, I see Richard. Is there anybody else? And there's scientists in the room. We got Pat and Steve over here, no science. Tira's scientists. We got lots of scientists in here, and all of them know more than me. So if at any point you have something to offer, I'm going to have time at the end for you to add your perspectives and things that you know that I don't, and just add it on to the layers of what we talk about today. So thank you for being here. Number 2, this is not a class where science proves that God is real. That's not our point. That's not our job here. But if you go on Google and you search up quantum faith or something like that, apparently you'll find my class from last week on YouTube, which the Westwicks told me. It popped right up, which that's pretty cool. But other than that, you'll probably find a lot of things that are either science trying to prove that God exists, or somehow religion trying to take control of the scientific process or overrule it. And that's not what we're here to do today. Which leads me to number 3, and this one's so important today. Correlation does not equal causation. Correlation does not equal causation. Things that seem connected aren't necessarily, but I say this because we are going to toe this line a lot today. This is kind of where we're going to live. In fact, a lot of this class, this is where we live, is in this line of correlations, things that just make you go, which is my goal for this class. If I make you go, I'm doing my job. We're going to start out today going back to the beginning. Last week we talked a little bit about places where we've seen the science and faith debate, or had seen issues come up between those two practices. And one of the things that comes up all the time when we talk about this is the creation narratives. Specifically Genesis 1 being the most famously debated one. So these creation narratives in the first 3 chapters of Genesis, they sit at the center of this debate, but why? Number 1, I think that there is an appearance that they're trying to answer scientific questions. This isn't a class about the myths of Genesis. I've taught that class in the past. This isn't a class about why they were created. I taught that class last year. But I know for a fact, and I can tell you the short version is, they're not trying to answer scientific questions. They're not trying to say, what is the timeline, the mechanism of the creation of the earth? They're not trying to answer physically what is the makeup of human beings. They're not thinking about how did men and women become separate things. Those aren't really the questions that they're asking from a scientific standpoint. The way we think about that evolves over time and has only come about really in the last, I don't know, maybe 700 or 800 years to the maximum at least. But the writers of these stories nearly 3,000 years ago were not concerned with scientific questions in the way we are. But it looks like it, which is why we see this clash between what are truly stories from an Eastern tradition entering into a Western, highly logical, highly scientific culture. Number 2, and the reason why this has all come to a head over the last 200 years is Charles Darwin's theory of evolution on the origins of species, is what it was published in 1859. Now this is, we always call it the theory of evolution, and if you see a Christian who doesn't believe in it talk about the theory of evolution, they'll be like, the theory of evolution. But actually, this is a highly proven theory. And it's one of the most well-supported scientific theories in history. In fact, one source I was looking at this week said it is more supported than germ theory, which we all, most of us, maybe not our health secretary, take for granted. That's pretty well supported scientifically. Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, very well supported. Unlike earlier scientific discoveries, where we had seen a little bit of schism sometimes between science and faith, for example, the idea of heliocentrism, the sun being at the center of the universe and the earth revolving around that, caused some issues with Christians because they were thinking, oh, that's not a firmament, and that, we're the center of the universe, don't you know? That caused some issues. But Charles Darwin's theory of evolution brought significantly more theological complications, which is what drove this wedge in and made it such a divisive issue. Number one, it suggested, potentially, that humans weren't specially created by God, but instead evolved from animals. If you're thinking about this from a theological standpoint, that makes me feel less special. That makes me feel less intent. It removed, which leads into the next point, which it removes the need for a divine designer of life. There's something about the relationship, this idea that I was made special and someone thought of it and then put me into existence. That has a theological implementation. It affects who I think I am in the world. Which leads to number three, which is it contradicted the belief that humans were made with a purpose. I was designed, I was made and created special, and because I was made and created special, I have a purpose. These are theological identities that live within people that appear to be challenged by Darwin's theory of evolution. And then the final one that caused a lot of issue as well is it challenged the idea that there was a perfect version of creation before everything fell into sin. The idea that there was a Garden of Eden when everything lived peacefully in harmony and was in its completed form before the chaos set in. That doesn't mesh well with the theory of evolution. So in response to these theological questions, we see the debate between science and religion, Christianity specifically, really start to broaden. Which leads us to an event called the Scopes Monkey Trial. I'm going to play for you a video, which is one of my favorite videos in the world. If you've ever seen me teach about the Scopes Monkey Trial, you've seen this video. Elijah's seen it before. This is one of my favorites. The Scopes Monkey Trial in 1925 is the culmination of, in American culture, this debate between Darwinism and Christian theology that rejected it. I'm going to show this video and then we'll talk a little bit about the fallout and how it has significantly impacted our Christian culture in America.
Hello. Today we're going to talk about the Scopes Monkey Trial.
Oh no, there we go. Yeah, isn't that a great video? It's great. It makes me so happy. Thanks for watching it. It also teaches it better than I could teach it. So the fallout of the Scopes trial in American history and American culture, especially evangelical culture, was really significant. One thing that's interesting to note is the motives of William Jennings Bryan. I have to not say it like a drunk guy. It's William Jennings Bryan. And he was a former presidential candidate. He'd actually ran probably 3 or 4 times and was never elected. But his political goal throughout his career was to unite the Christian fundamentalist base politically. Does it sound familiar? What is actually interesting is he was morally, socially very conservative, whereas like economically he was very what they would call progressive. He wanted to unite the fundamentalist Christian base under really conservative social values in order to make social justice changes, workers' rights, economic justice, things like that. Really interesting. But what he did do is he really tried to specifically corral this voter base into elevating his political career. He never succeeded at becoming president, but that's why he was the perfect person to be the face of the evangelical side of this trial. After the trial, because it was broadcast on the radio, and because so many people had tuned in, and it had just been so clear who won the debate, even though Scope was convicted, they lost. Darrow lost the trial, and William Jennings Bryan won. I swear it's just water. Even though that's how the trial officially ended, the public scope of things did not see it that way. And fundamentalist Christians began to distance themselves from society, feeling belittled and attacked. I don't know, this is interesting because it's kind of flipped around sometimes, but I feel this way. Like I have to not tell people I'm Christian because I don't want them to make these assumptions about me. But that is kind of what happened with fundamentalist culture right following this, is they started to say, okay, we're going to back off then. We're not going to be involved in politics. We're not going to be involved in public life. We're going to go do our own thing in our own spaces. And they started to create their own schools and institutions underneath these religious exemptions. One of the schools that was invented in 1927, 2 years after the Scopes Monkey trial, was called Bob Jones University. If you're familiar with Bob Jones, very, very significant institution to have been created at this time. Billy Graham turned fundamentalists into evangelicals as like a rebranding and said, hey, we need to get back out there. We need to get back out into public life. We need to get into politics. We need to push these values into the country because that's what we're called to do. And that was largely, again, this revival of this, what was fundamentalist, now evangelical base of Christians re-engaging with culture and politics. And ultimately, what this all led to was in the 70s and 80s, and Bob Jones University fighting to maintain segregation and tax-exempt status, this perfect storm for the religious right to be created as it merged with Jerry Falwell's moral majority, and Christianity and the political right in America came hand in hand under similar context, similar strategies even, to what William Jennings Bryan was trying to use earlier on. This trial has had massive fallouts. We are where we are today because there are still Christians who now have that Christian identity tied politically, and it's tied to this sense of shame and belittlement. Like, people think I am less because I am Christian. And that goes back in American culture largely to this day. It cannot be overstated how important this was. Yeah. Here's what I think is interesting, though, is we already acknowledged, okay, culturally really important, and we already acknowledge that Genesis, not designed to answer scientific questions in the first place. Like, we've gotten to this problem, one, because now we've seen there are some political forces that are actually driving this wedge between science and religion. And two, because we're asking questions of a text that it was never designed to answer. With that noted, allow me to wade into the world of correlation. There's some things I thought were really interesting when I was reading through the lens of quantum faith or quantum physics, and also like scientific creation that I thought were really interesting. So we're going to compare a couple things together. What I found is, if you are a little bit loose with it, Genesis 1 actually gets a shocking amount of things right. According to Genesis 1, let there be light is the first thing God speaks. And according to the scientific creation account, high-energy photons, particles of light, existed before even matter existed. It just, 10 to the negative 32 seconds after the hot Big Bang. The quickest, earliest fraction. Now, if we're splitting hairs, it was contained in entirely like super dense plasma and you couldn't actually see it, so does it really count as light? I say, yeah, they're photons, they count as light. But that was one of the first things ever to exist. According to Genesis 1, next thing that came around was the creation of day and night. If we look according to scientific creation, Earth's rotation began about 4.6 billion years ago, which the rotation of the Earth would give what we know as day and night. As the Earth turns, we see the sun and the moon rise and fall. Next, we have the creation of the firmament in Genesis 1, 6 through 7, the first atmosphere. The firmament being the dome that covers the Earth and the flat Earth version of things. And then after the Earth begins rotating, the first atmosphere forms on the Earth about 4.5 billion years ago. So just 0.1 billion years after the rotation formed. Then we see the separation of land and sea. And we see the first oceans forming on Earth 4.4 billion years ago. We see the creation of plants, then animals in 12 through 27. That's the rest of the Genesis 1 creation story. And we see them in the same order come around according to evolution. We see plants 1 billion years ago, animals 800 million years ago, and humans come around about 300,000 years ago. I'm not saying, we already covered this, we already discussed, Genesis 1 is not answering these questions. They're not trying to. This is not a scientific account. What I think is interesting is that they seem to have some sort of idea, while not even trying, of some intuitive sense of like, this is kind of the order of things. This is kind of how the universe has to work. This just makes sense. They're not running experiments. They're not writing papers. They're not testing it. That's not their goal. Some people were charting stars, but this is not the goal of these books, and yet still, we see an intuition present in it that I think is really interesting. So this is where, again, I say remember disclaimer number 2, this is not a class where science proves God is real. That's not my point behind this intuition. I'm not saying Genesis 2 that was right. What I'm talking about is this intuitive understanding. And if we believe that we are created in the image of God, or even if we believe that some piece of God lives within us, and if God is truly in, with, and under all things, as Luther would say, then maybe we have some sort of deep spiritual connection to all of creation. This just got me thinking. This coincidence, maybe in Genesis chapter 1, got me thinking, what is it that lies deeply within us? Do we have a sense of things we don't even know before we know them? Which is why I titled this class today, Probably. Because we have all had times where we've known something we absolutely can't know or shouldn't be able to know. Have you ever been somewhere and known that you are in danger even though there are no physical signs to prove it to you? You can just feel it? Yeah. Have you ever felt deeply connected to someone so much that you could practically read their mind? Or maybe you've even said, we are so on the same wavelength right now. What's interesting is science has actually shown us that these things happen, which is crazy. They've shown that when you're connected with someone without physical touch even being necessary, your heartbeats can literally sync up, which is really cool. Yeah, Elijah, what you got?
Sometimes I feel like I'm in danger and there's no danger.
Sometimes you feel like you're in danger and there is no danger. Yeah, which is why probably, right? We do have an intuitive sense. Science has also shown us, this is crazy, and I think it happens at like big concerts and events like this too, or even with a band playing on stage, that without touching one another, your brain waves can sync up. So you are literally on the same wavelength. You are literally thinking the same thing with people you're not touching. That could bring a whole new way to understand a lot of different things. Music, religion, all sorts of group experiences, sex. Really interesting that we can actually be physically synced up that way. And we haven't known about that until like this decade that this happens. But we've been feeling it for a very, very long time. We walk around the world with this intuition, which I'll call probably. We can call it instinct, we can call it evolution, call it reasoning, whatever you will. But this intuitive sense, I think, drives our curiosity. It's part of what we go around the world feeling like things are the way they are, and then it reveals to us, well, do I actually know that? Is there actually danger right now? I feel like there is. I feel like if I drop this, it's gonna fall, and then we have gravity. I feel like if we do this and that, we're gonna have these actions. We have this probable intuitive sense within us, and it's part of our survival. It's part of how we compartmentalize the world. It's how we make life easier on our brains by putting 2 and 2 together and making what we think is 4. It isn't always, though, which is what leads us to a lot of scientific discovery. It is worth noting, and Elijah already brought this up a little bit, it can be a barrier to our growth as well if we choose to live there too much and trust it too much and take our sense of intuition, our instinct as the golden standard, right? Because it can block us from actually understanding what we don't know. This is ignorance, and it's a driving force behind that as well. I want to compare, and we're going to spend most of the rest of our class talking about this, the potential crossovers between what I've called probably, our instinct, our intuition, whatever we want to call it, and the world of probability, which we were introduced to last week. I make the case that our universe also likes to say probably, and it does it through a lot of math that I don't understand. If you see this picture on the right, this will remind you of last week, the double slit experiment. And the interference wave pattern that we learned was a function of the probability characteristics of quantum particles. Because quantum mechanics theorizes that all these quantum particles exist as waves of probability until they're measured. We can guess where they're most likely to be, but we can never know with certainty. And that's what's demonstrated in this. We can know that if we run the double slit experiment, and this is our back screen, that they're probably, most of them are going to end up in that middle. Some are going to end up in one of those other bands, less and less, till we get to the outside. But we can't know for sure. We can take our best guess, but who knows where it's actually going to come up. The universe, this is not just fun for us to look at. Like, this is the chairs you're sitting on. Everything exists based on this principle that is truth. And then there's another principle that utilizes probability that we're going to talk about today, which is called entropy. Entropy was invented by Rudolf Clausius, who was exploring thermodynamic systems that made up the revolutionary steam engine. The steam engine was one of the most significant inventions in human history. The ability to convert heat into work output via coal or another source of energy changed the world, made a large part of the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution happen because this ability to create such intense work from a heat source. And what happened is the first ones were created, and they kept getting a little bit better. And eventually they got to some steam engines that they were like, these are really good. They're about 75% efficient. And we would like to get closer to 100 efficient, so we get more out of each lump of coal that we burn. And this set off an incredible race amongst physicists, amongst engineers, trying to figure out, why can't we seem to get better than 75% about efficiency in our steam engines? What is happening to the energy that we should be able to capture, that we should be able to use to make work? And Claudius was one of the leaders in this. In 1862, he stated what is now called the second law of thermodynamics. He said it this way. Might sound a little confusing. He says, a cyclic transformation whose only final result is to transfer heat from a body at a given temperature to a body at a higher temperature is impossible. In other words, if you take a warm cup of coffee and set it next to a hot cup of coffee and put them right next to each other so they're touching like this, it's very unlikely, impossible in fact, he states, if we're not dealing with other factors, that the hot one just gets hotter, that the heat flows in the direction from the less hot cup to the hotter cup, and it gets hotter. That, he says, is not how heat works. This went on, and he expressed it in a mathematical formulation that actually explains why we're stuck at about 75% efficiency on the steam engine. And he coins the term to explain this as entropy, which comes from the Greek word entropia, a turning toward is what that means, because he's saying that this the energy is turning elsewhere, it's transforming in a way. So practically, what he discovered is that heat energy dissipates within a closed system. It spreads out, whether it's friction, whether it's being transferred to other materials that aren't the direction you want it to be transferred to, but it dissipates within a closed system, and that limits the work heat can do, and his equation demonstrates that. Technically, what he's saying is that entropy is the measure of unavailable energy within a thermodynamic system. The measurement of, as we go along, some of this energy gets spread out, gets dissipated, gets used up, and is no longer available for us to do work in our steam engines. This is the birth of this concept of entropy. Now we're going to talk a little bit about entropy and probability, which comes along with Ludwig Boltzmann. He pitched entropy as a concept of probability, and I'm going to actually use a demonstration to do this. So I'm going to take this out here. I have here some Jenga blocks, and what I want to know is how many of you think if I were to dump this box of blocks out, it would land on the floor here and make a perfect 3x3 Jenga tower. Anybody? Raise of hands? No? No one thinks that's going to happen? Zero. What about if every single one of us in this room had one of these boxes and we all tried it? Do you think it would land in a perfect tower? No? What if I tried it? What if I took this box and I tried it for the next year, as fast as I can, dumping them out, picking them back up, dumping them back out? Raise a hand. Who thinks it might happen once in that time? What if we all did it? What if every one of us for the next 20 years took this box and we dumped it out, and no one thinks that would happen? Let's try it. I've been waiting all day to do that. Yeah, it didn't work. This is the heart of entropy as a result of probability. If we think of these Jenga blocks as quantum particles, what we learn is it's very unlikely that they are to order themselves without someone else stepping in to do that work. Because there is so many other ways for them to be arranged that the odds they fall into the one perfect one, highly, highly unlikely. This is a quantum reality. And this is what Ludwig Boltzmann prepares for us. He says that energy has an inevitable tendency to spread out, to move from a higher concentration to a lower concentration. If we think about our Jenga blocks as not just subatomic particles, but energy within bonds, everything that we have in existence is held together by bonded particles, things that are held together, and energy is those bonds. Energy can also move within those bonds from place to place. And what Ludwig Boltzmann says is there is so much more likelihood that the random movements of energy within these bonds is going to spread out than condense all in one place. It's possible. It can condense all in one place. It could happen, but it's highly unlikely because that's just one outcome. That's the Jenga tower when there's a million other ways for it to be spread out, to be dissipated. By the way, we do have a word for these things that are possible but never happen. We call them miracles, which, contrary to popular belief, aren't necessarily things that defy laws of physics. They're just things that defy incredibly long odds of probability. So energy, Boltzmann says, has this inevitable tendency to spread out, to move from places where it's higher concentrated to lower concentrated. It also has a tendency to move from ordered states to disordered states. And the concept then becomes that entropy is always increasing, and this entropy being the measure of dissipation, the measure of disorder within a system. And this is true, we've learned, not just with heat, which is where it originally all started out, but with all energy, like we're talking about, these molecules, these particles, energy within the very bedrocks of all of our mass. And it doesn't just work within thermodynamic systems, but this is true among all systems that exchange energy. And the universe is one big energy system. We have our current understanding of the universe explains that it is not infinite, it is finite. There are edges to it. It began with a finite amount of stuff in it, and that means that it is all within itself a closed system. This would then say, if we were to restate the second law, which was designed for thermodynamics but now has much bigger application, that entropy is always increasing in the universe. So in the universe, energy always has a tendency to dissipate. It always has a tendency to spread from places of higher concentration to lower concentration, from ordered states to disordered states in the universe. So, what does this mean and why might it matter? Entropy has been called supreme among the natural laws. It does a lot of things. It is responsible as a principle for a lot of things. I say this like it's active. It's not an active force. It is something that happens that we've observed that happens. But it does, in fact, govern life and death. When we eat food and we need the energy of it to go into our bodies so that we can live, so that we can perform the basic actions of life, it is entropy that helps us process that food, and it dissipates, it spreads out through our body. Our metabolism happens because entropy exists. On the other hand, aging, dying, decay, all of those things are also a same part of this principle of the energy in the universe having this tendency to need to spread out, to go from the incredibly ordered form that is the human body back to the disorder of the soil, the nutrients, the basic pieces of it. Another one that has been said about entropy, another major effect, it's been said that it gives time its arrow or its talons, gives time its talons. And this is because entropy is an irreversible process in a vacuum, and that it has increased unendingly since the Big Bang. And we've talked about how the universe as a whole is a closed system, and within that system, entropy has increased. If we go back and look back through time, on a universe-wide standpoint, we will always find a place that had less entropy than we have in our current universe right now. And in the future, it's going to have more entropy than we have right now. This is why the scientific end of existence ends on either a cold or a heat death, which are both different ways to explain a possible time in the future of maximum entropy in the universe, where everything ends up being so chaotic it's all destroyed. This is just a fact. But what does it mean to us to think then about entropy? Anyway, we feel like we really have a good understanding of this yet? Yeah? No. No one does. I don't understand it. But what does it mean to us? Have you ever said something like, the world seems to always get more and more chaotic? Or have you ever said the phrase, back in a simpler time? Or it's so much easier to tear something down than to build it back up? Or have you ever had the thought, the odds of everything lining up perfectly, that's basically zero? Remember, disclaimer number 3, correlation does not equal causation. This is really important because I said we're towing this line, and we really are. These ideas that I just stated, these thoughts that we have, they are not mechanically linked to the scientific principle of entropy. They are not the same thing. We have no evidence to suggest that they are. And yet, it kind of feels like they are, right? Like a piece of it connects with us in here. And when we have that feeling, we actually get an understanding of this separate scientific principle that governs our universe in a little bit clearer way. There's another story in Genesis. Yeah, Elijah.
Before we get off entropy, are you going to talk about Boseman's?
I'm not talking Boseman today. I don't have Boseman in here, but we're not getting off entropy, so there will be time at the end, okay? There's another story in Genesis. We talked about one creation story. There's actually 2 creation stories. Genesis 1 is its own, and then Genesis 2 and 3 is a separate story. This story is known as the Garden of Eden. And in this story, it starts out, there's a creation in the garden, and it's perfect. And everyone lives together in peace and harmony. Humans live in harmony with the land, with the creatures, with one another, and they also live in harmony with God. Everything does. It is perfect peace and order between all of creation. And then an event happens where Adam and Eve eat the fruit of the tree of knowledge and good and evil. And as a result, they are sent out of the garden into a chaotic world. I think you can zoom in even further and see potentially an intuition here. In Genesis 2:7, it says that when Adam was created, the Lord God formed the man of dust from the ground, an incredible ordering of dust, the tiniest of particles, into such a complex human being. And then in 3:19, after the fruit was eaten and they were being cursed and banished, God says this to them, "By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread until you return to the ground, because from it you were taken, for you are dust, and to dust you shall return." We have order, and then we have this tendency to dissipate, to become dust once again. It's really interesting what the Genesis authors might have had some sort of intuition on. Which leads me to my last thought, and once we're done with this, we'll have time for questions and any discussion today. Sometimes it can feel like evil and chaos and disorder are the way of the world. And when we think about entropy, we can easily make this link between evil and entropy because we have that sense. We have this sense that the authors of Genesis probably had where they say, the world had to at one point have been better than this, and now everything seems like it's always going bad. Everything's always getting messed up, and it takes so much work. If we want to fix things, that takes a lot of work, but if we just leave it alone, it always seems to fall apart. So it can feel like there's a connection between this idea of entropy and the idea of evil, the existence of evil in the world that we experience in our lives. There's a theologian, I wrote a paper on him in my first year of seminary, named Robert John Russell, who explores this concept of entropy and evil. He says that evil causes disorder and chaos, but God causes order and peace. And he doesn't say that these two are literally connected. He says, once again, that this might be a metaphor. The entropy might be a metaphor for helping us understand the nature of evil, this fundamental truth that we know deep within us, that there seems to be a tendency to the way things go in our societies, in our cultures, in our relationships, unless we put in additional work to reorder them, right? And we know that peacemaking and empathy and selflessness, They all require us to put in the extra energy. Ultimately, though, and this is what I was trying to talk about before, the metaphor falls short because entropy is not a negative principle. It's responsible for forces that we deem both positive and negative in the world. Like we said, it governs both life and death. Everything we need to happen happens because of it. We'll get to it in just a second. Everything we need to happen happens because of entropy. It drives fundamental forces of our lives in really, really valuable ways. When we need our coffee's too hot in the morning and we need to wait a minute so we can drink it, that's entropy at work. From eating food, drinking our coffee, all of this is a result of the process, the principle of entropy at work in the world. And it does good and bad things, or things that we deem to be good and bad. It does make you wonder, though, if the Israelites had this sort of intuitive sense. It makes me really curious. Again, Genesis chapter 2 and 3, I said this about the first one, Genesis chapter 2 and 3, not a scientific story. They are not trying to answer this question. They are not trying to explain thermodynamics. That is not their goal. But they did somehow have this thing in their gut where they're like, this must have been, somehow there had to have been a break. Sometime there had to be a start to when things started falling apart. And they had this intuition that will be a key for them, for us in our study of that text. And then also it's something that we know, that we understand deep within us as well. So my question, and after this we'll all open for discussion, for addition, for other questions, for the scientists in the room to pitch in, because I'm sure you have things to add that I don't, is does this intuitive sense live within us as well? Thinking about this for me, like I said before, it is a cautious exercise because I don't want to trust my intuition too much. I have lived enough life as a straight white man to know that the things I assume to be true in the world are not always true in the world, and that my experience and my 2 + 2s don't always equal 4 in the way that everyone else's does. And yet, being able to trust our guts, to being able to listen to that little voice in our head, we might call it inspiration, we might call it Holy Spirit. It's interesting what that might be able to do to pique our curiosity, to open us up to new horizons, and to see where we can learn and grow, because we do have this probable sense within us. So I'll open it up. Yeah, Elijah, you want to start us off? In fact, Becky's going to run a mic back to you.
I just want to say I learned all of this from a TED video, so...
Say that again in the mic so people can hear you.
I learned all of this from an educational video, so you're gonna have to forgive me. Boseman's brain theory, it's like a thought experiment.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's like you mentioned, like, it's possible for entropy to cause things to come together, but it's very unlikely.
Mm-hmm.
So if entropy is the principle in the universe, he was trying to answer the question of how does all of this exist if entropy is the principle of the universe? And his theory was that all of this does not exist. We do exist, but not as we think. It's like entropy randomly creates brains. Like if you tip the blocks over, it creates some semblance of a human brain that fills up with false memories.
Wow. That's really interesting. What I do hear at
the interesting thing is you can't fault him for his logic, and also it's infinitely more likely that happened than all of this happened, because it takes a lot more energy to create a whole universe than it does to create a bunch of brain things.
It's really interesting. So what I hear at the core of that is this question that comes up when we talk about entropy. We talk about if there's a likelihood for disordering, how have things come together in such a unique order in our specific place and time so that we exist in the way that we do? There are several answers to this. Let's let Steve take the first shot since he knows more about science than I do.
Yeah, I once heard a fundamentalist try to disprove evolution by referring to entropy. because evolution takes living creatures to more and more complex states, right? Human beings are more complex than other animals,
Sure.
right? Well, this fundamentalist was saying, now that can't possibly happen because of the principle of entropy and the tendency toward disorder, right? Okay, the challenge then is, what's the flaw in that argument?
Well, do you not have the answer?
I have the answer. I'm just
My guess would be,
I'm quizzing you.
if you're quizzing me, my guess response to that would be that while entropy scientifically, physically, is highly proven, socially, psychologically, evolutionarily, not highly proven as a concept that it exists in that way. So,
Yeah.
for example, social Darwinism is not an example of entropy.
Yeah.
But what do you have?
The fatal flaw in that argument is that the Earth is not a closed system. Right?
Yeah, of course.
The sun delivers astounding amounts of energy to the Earth every
Yes.
second, and
Yeah.
so that is the energy that drives evolution. So that's the fatal flaw in the fundamentalist argument that entropy
Yeah.
disproves evolution.
Yeah, it's the old, if you're going to build a perpetual motion machine, you have to
Right,
hide the
yeah.
battery somewhere,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, right.
The sun is our battery that keeps driving
Exactly.
energy, but we don't necessarily see it. We don't know that it's happening to
right,
us.
right. So we
Yeah.
we forget about this sun that is driving everything,
Yeah,
all of the activities on Earth.
that's a great point.
Now, I have some. I hope I don't just drone on and on here, but I have another point about
Please.
Genesis 1, the first creation story.
Yeah,
I don't know if it's so much intuition that the authors had, but the first creation story is the priestly version, from the priestly tradition. And so the priests in the temple were part of a very ordered hierarchy. So they were all about order, and that's a principal characteristic of the first creation story. And that had to influence how they wrote that story.
the hierarchical.
The
understanding.
hierarchical characteristic of that story, from simple to complex.
Yeah.
And I guess that's my feeling as to how that ended up aligning so closely to the scientific concept of
Yeah.
how things were, how creation happened.
That's interesting. I've heard that same concept talked about as what's called a divinity ethic, the idea that some things are more like God and other things are less.
Yeah, right,
And that might be what they were kind of getting at, and the more simple things to the complex
More-
beings like
yes.
humans are more divine
Yeah, yeah.
than the other things, which
Yeah,
opens up a whole
from
other range of
simple to
questions.
complex, just like the hierarchy of priests in the temple.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. To Elijah.
I mean, at that point, weren't they in exile? Like,
That story was probably written during exile, yeah.
I mean, that sort of makes sense, like, moving from order to chaos. Like, you could also see that in the exile story, like, they were in Jerusalem, they had the temple, and then it was destroyed and they were all dispersed.
The second creation story in the Bible, Genesis 2 and 3, probably predated the existence of the exile. But I could definitely see the correlations, and could have been motivation for, hey, why we should collect these stories and write it down and make sure that people can read it. Next.
I don't know, maybe it's tangential.
Please.
But I'm thinking about, where does homeostasis come into this? Like, it's not like in the body. It's not that you just eat food and it goes randomly wherever. It's a
Yeah.
balancing act, right? It's going where it's needed. You're getting rid of what you don't to keep
Definitely.
things in balance. So is it going to chaos or is it going to a level place? And then the other thing I think of just popped in my brain from Steve's comment about, being the ultimate being, the human beings. Well, I'm not adapted to live in the ocean.
Yeah.
So to talk about, like, are we the ultimate creature? Well, maybe in the situation I live in, but it doesn't speak to anything as to your environment and what you're adapted
Yeah.
to live in.
Yeah, I think so. To answer my answer to, and then I'll open this to scientists, real people who know more than me. My answer to the second one is I don't think ultimate creature is the right way I would say it. I think what I was trying to explain was this belief that goes way, way back in our tradition that human beings are made in the image of God, and that there is not that we are. And I mean, we're not ultimate compared to a black bear or something like that. You know, if we're talking violence or power, but there's this idea, theological idea, that something about our ability, our consciousness, our ability to be self-aware in this way has made us more divine than other creatures that do not have that. That may or may not be true, but that's what I think the priests would have thought and would have tapped into. The other thing I would say to the first one about homeostasis and where that comes in, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I would point that back again to what Steve said, that our human bodies are not closed systems either, right? They also, the energy that you said, we use some, we dispel some. Well, that energy then goes and has a purpose elsewhere too, and we are taking in energy from another place as well. So we have adapted, evolved to have exactly what we need, and then the rest of it still is made to use. The entropy process happens before and after we enter into it as well, and as part of that equation. So can anyone elaborate on that better than I can, or is that sufficient? Okay. Ooh, I got that one. I got one right. Yay. Isn't that cool? That's cool. Does anyone have any other questions or thoughts or comments, things that might add a layer to this topic today? Yes, I've been waiting for you, Tom.
So nature, we look outside the window, how beautiful it is out there. That's the natural side of God manifested. And
Sure.
It's the wild side too, I love it. But we are part of nature. Okay, and that's our local perspective that we carry that around with us daily. In fact, we talk and we think that way. We talk about the horizon, you know, whereas if you go up in a spaceship, the horizon's much broader. So we are inside of this natural system, and we have a strong tendency to think that way. Even the human body is very interesting because there is local entropy and local stability within the human body. We know that we age because our DNA strands are becoming, in the nucleus, the atoms, the cells are becoming unstranded at the ends, right? So we're decaying and we'll die. So entropy is going to win that one physically. So that perspective issue is we tend to think of and see things from with our own myopic perspective. But to see what's going on to the system, how the system works, how it evolves, et cetera, you've got to be outside the system. And to be outside of nature is God. So when Jesus walked on water and he, you know, how do you do that, right? In order to do that, you can't be controlled by nature. You are the controller of nature. Okay. So as an engineer, you know, go back one more thing about the whole perspective issue. If I build a system that's got cogs and gears and shafts and all other things moving, et cetera, if I am a gear inside that system, that's my perspective. If I'm the one that built it, I'm on the outside looking in. And I see all the manifestations of it, and I control it, and I change it. So we have physics is the study of the natural world. In fact, it used to be called the natural philosophy. And so with physics, we do our best attempt, and we do a pretty good job of slowly chipping away of understanding the natural world. Not the spiritual world, the natural world. And so that leads us into this big discussion of this side-by-side comparison that you're doing a great job with, the correlation aspect of it. So that's my 2 cents.
Tom, thank you. Thank you. You know, if I ever run part 2 of this class, you're coming with me. I'm going to bring you up here. We're going to co-teach that because that was really excellent. Thank you. Anything else for the good of the order? Yeah. Please, that would be great.
Just very quickly, when you mentioned we came from dust, and to dust we return. We're coming up on land. We're going to hear that again.
Yes.
Just want to remind everyone that Carl Sagan pointed out that we are all made of stardust.
Yes.
And so if you really have to expand our sense of belonging to the universe, understanding that we're all made of the same stuff.
Not a closed system. Love that. Thanks, Pat. That's a good ending point. Thanks to everybody for coming. Thanks for the discussion and your contributions. And we got one more week next week.